Okay, so welcome to another video in the 3D print workshop. In this one, I'm going to be going over the second geometric type, which is the minimal surface, this one you see here. I'm going to show you some of the techniques for modeling this type of surface, and basically what you can do with that type of geometry. So this is the kind of example of the type of surface we're doing. This is from the sculptor Erwin Hauer, and this type of surface, so I'm also going to point you towards this resource, which is, if you just Google minimal surfaces we want to learn, which is a blog here, take you to this article. And so this kind of outlines like what some of the kind of main types of minimal surface are. And so we're going to make a type that we can kind of do these two with. And that is also the same as this, which is also the same as this. So I don't know if you can see one of those modules. That's basically what we're going to model, the kind of saddle surface component of that. So the way to work, and let me just go back real quick. So before I start, I also want to point out the rules, which are 2x2x2 cube, 3x3x1 kind of tile. And the module has to join itself on at least two separate planes, which means, you know, this side are one, this side and this side are one, this face and the back face are all one. So this one I'm going to start with a 2x2x2 cube. So here I am in Rhino. First thing I'll do is set up my units. I just typed in units there. From the drop down, I'm going to choose inches. Okay. And just if you don't remember, in order to orbit in a top view or in an orthogonal view, you just hold Control-Shift on the keyboard, right-click, and drag. Now you can also, excuse me, if you're on a Mac or something, you don't know what the shortcut is, you can also just grab this orbit tool from the standard menu there. The first thing I'm going to do is model that bounding box. I'll just use the command box. And I'm going to start at 0, 0. So 0, 0, and press enter. And then 2 inches by 2 inches by 2 inches. All right, and then I'll put it in ghosted. And I just want to point out, oh yeah, if you want your ghost to be a little more transparent, what you want to do is go to Display Properties. That should open up this panel I have here on the right. You can see right here I'm in ghosted. If I scroll down a little bit under transparency, I can change like how much I'm seeing through an object. Also, if I want to change the center of my orbit, I just select that object and go zoom or Z enter, and then hits the option selected or S enter, and then it will just set that object to the center of my orbit. So what I'm going to do first, and let me go into a new layer here, I'm going to set that as my bounding box and just lock it. And I'm going to start by drawing a few curves. So the kind of technique with most of these geometries, so I'll show you some of the other ones here. But the technique is, generally speaking, to number one, to model the edge curves first, and number two, to figure out what the kind of essential surfaces are of that surface. So if we look at this example for one, you can see that they're modeling like a segment. That's like this little chunk of that geometry, and they're modeling a segment of that chunk, which is repeated to form that. Right? So there's a kind of essential surface somewhere. The same thing's happening here. There's like a little chunk that gets repeated to form that surface, which gets repeated to form that whole thing. So, and the thing about Rhino is, you know, because of the way that you model with it, every surface has to have 4 edges. So for example, even when I draw a 4-point surface, oops, I didn't do that. When I draw a 4-point surface, but I stop and press enter on the third one, and I look at those iso curves, right? What's actually happening here is I've created a trimmed 4-point surface. So if I use the command untrim, that's actually just a trimmed 4-point surface. So basically the structure of every surface in Rhino is thus that it has 4 edges. So what I need to do first, again, is just to draw those kind of outlines that form the boundary of that surface. I'm going to do that by drawing a series of arcs. And I'm using my bounding box as the kind of framework or the guide. So it'll ask me for a center of an arc. I'm going to choose one of the corners of my box on the base there. And then I'll go to the midpoint of one edge and drag it across to the midpoint of the other edge. And I'm going to do that on the opposite corner. So again, center around the opposite corner and then midpoint to midpoint. So those are 2 of the edges I'm going to use, and I just need these to get the dimensions right. And I'll show you what that means. And then I'm going to draw a circle. So I'll use the command circle. I'm going to hit this option 2 point. And then I'm going to snap to the midpoint of the arc I just drew and the midpoint of the opposing arc I just drew. Okay, so now we should get a circle that is spanning between those 2 edges. And then what I want to do is actually rotate this guy so that it's like vertical, perpendicular to the bottom of the box. So I'm going to use the command rotate 3D, snap to the midpoint and the opposite midpoint, and rotate it by 90 degrees. I'm going to turn off copy. So you can do that by holding shift or by typing in 90. Okay, so we actually have already more edges than we actually need to make this surface. So one of these surfaces, and maybe you can start to see the kind of saddle form already. But what I'm going to draw is the other 2 edges of my segment of my surface. I'll use the command line, and I'm going to choose the option vertical here. I'm going to go to one of these end points of one of my arcs. You can see I'm only drawing up and down in the Z dimension. And then I want to snap to the midpoint, or the quad, same thing, of my circle that I've just rotated. And then I'll draw one more line just from the end of that line and again to the quad or the midpoint. And so that segment you see outlined is the surface we're going to draw, and then we'll be able to take that surface and just repeat it, mirror it or rotate it to form the whole kind of saddle form. So what I need to do next is get all these edges of that little segment to be a single like curve. So you can see with this circle, it's still a full circle. But what I want to do is go ahead and select that guy and type in split. And then I'll click on all 3 of the edges that I want to split it with. We just need that segment, if that makes sense, the edge that's going to form an edge of our surface. And I need to do the same with this guy. So select that one, type in split, and use the circle. There we go. And so now we have all 4 segments as individuals. And I'm actually just going to delete the rest of the stuff. We don't need it. And it'll be a little less messy if I do. So what I want to do next is I'm going to make a surface between these edges. Now, the way I'm going to do it is use the command sweep 2. Which, if maybe you're familiar with this, but basically sweep 2 uses like 2 rail curves and 2 what are called cross-section curves. And so it'll take like this cross-section, for example, and it'll kind of form it along these 2 rail curves. So those ends will like continue along the rail curve, and then it'll blend into that cross-section. So we can make pretty kind of sophisticated surfaces this way. Let me just show the video real quick, the animation. And the other thing to watch out for is you want to be careful the order in which you select the edges. So you can see you select the 2 rail curves first and then the cross-section curves. And that's the kind of thing it makes. So I'm going to do the same thing here. Now, what I need to actually happen, I'm going to turn the bounding box off for a sec. I'll type in sweep 2. And again, it'll ask me for the rail. That's one rail. Second rail. So the second rail is not either of the curves that are joining that first line I selected, right? It has to be the parallel edge. And then it'll ask for cross-section, enter. So first of all, the reason that this works is because the edge curves are gonna form a kind of boundary. or the surface basically makes a tangent with itself when you like mirror it or rotate it. And I'll show you what I mean by that. I'm going to just hit do not change cross sections. That's what we want. You can want to have all these options turned off. Click OK. So now we have that segment. If I were to go back and do like I was telling you, I would mirror that along that edge. Then I could rotate it, rotate 3D, oops, along another edge, 180 degrees. And you can see before long we've already made the surface, right? So there's the saddle surface that I'm making. Now if I put it in shaded view, or actually, sorry. So the best way to tell whether or not you have a smooth surface, even though it's formed of segments, is to put it in rendered view. I'm going to go change into rendered view. So you can see, even though it's pretty smooth, we still have little seams there. And I just want to explain kind of how to deal with that if you're working in really any type of model. So I'm going to preserve this. I'm going to preserve this and then do it one more time. But this time I'm going to do it in a different way. So what I really need to have happen is like the direction of the surface where it meets the next segment. I need the tangent of the surface, in other words, the direction, to be perfectly lined up. And how would I do that? Well, instead of using the curves here, what I'm going to do is create some surfaces here. So if I take this arc, for example, and just use the command extrude curve, oops, extrude curve. And because that arc is planar, it's already going to extrude perpendicular, so we can just pull it out like that. And I'm going to delete that line, that edge. And I'll do the same for this bottom edge, extrude curve, pull it down. And then for this edge, we want the tangent direction to be straight out that way. If it doesn't go that way, by default, just hit the option direction, hold shift and drag a line to set a direction. And then this one's the only one that's a little bit tricky. What we actually want is a surface that's going up at this edge, so vertical at this edge, and then horizontal at that edge. And so what I'll do is just draw myself a couple of guidelines. And I'll use the command line, option vertical. And then I'm just going to use this 4-point surface. 1, 2, 3, and 4. You can see it's going horizontal over there and it's going vertical over there. Now, I'm going to do the same exact operation. I'm going to do a sweep 2. I want to delete all these curves though, because if I use the edges of these surfaces, what I can do with sweep is actually pull the direction of that surface into the kind of calculation of how the surface gets made. So I'll type in sweep 2. Again, so I think also we want to select the vertical lines this time. I'm going to go vertical and vertical. Those are my rail curves. That's important. And then cross section, horizontal, horizontal. Press enter. And I believe, okay, so what you can actually do is instead of hitting do not change cross sections, if we hit this time refit cross sections, what we actually want is to set it so that the tangency of the set it so that the surface is matching the tangency at each edge. We're going to change A and B to tangency. And you can see if we set it to position, the surface is a little bit looser, right? Set it to tangency, it's a little bit tighter. Then I'll click OK. And now if I were to take this surface and do the same thing, mirror it, and rotate it, you can see it's just about perfect. So we don't really have those seams that we had before. And what's really nice about that is, you know, when we print our geometry, and especially when you 3D print, what happens is the geometry gets turned into a mesh. And with meshes, obviously that means it gets like kind of tessellated. It turns into a surface that's made up of triangles or little squares. And so we want a really smooth surface to kind of transform that geometry into. And basically that's it. So that's a little segment, just like with all of these examples, they have kind of that little segment that you can then repeat and rotate. And what that means is we don't necessarily have to make this kind of surface. We can make any kind of surface just kind of by operating with that segment. So once you have that geometry, then I would say just go ahead and start to play with it and do exactly like what I was doing. So mirror it. And you can mirror it. If you use the mirror command, you can also mirror 3-point. I can mirror it like across a plane. You know, and you can mirror it in such a way where it, you know, forms a continuous edge or doesn't. You can rotate it. Or you can rotate 3D and rotate along one of its edges. Right? So just kind of play around with it and see what kind of surfaces you can make. So this one, for example, is the, if I'm not mistaken, that one is that guy right there, the Shirk's Tower, or Shirk's Surface, which is just another, you know, kind of version of that. Or another different segment of that, right? And you can also kind of move it. And I also say, you know, we used one certain dimension to draw this, but that doesn't mean that you're stuck at that dimension, right? So once you have the surface, you know, you can make a whole lot of different kinds of shapes. And obviously you can, you know, if I do scale 2D or something, right, I can kind of change what that surface is. Oops. Right, and we should get still the same kind of smooth kind of transitions between surfaces. But yeah, I would just encourage you to like play around with it and try different ways of putting this thing together. And there is no right answer, so just kind of see what things you can make. And then, you know, obviously the next step will be to, I didn't mean to do that, but whatever. The next step will be to, that's kind of cool, to kind of take this geometry and figure out how to make it into a module that you can print, 3D print. And then, of course, you'll have to go back and turn your bounding box back on and kind of make sure that it fits within that volume, etc. Put it back in ghosted. So if I wanted this guy to fit inside this box, I would just scale it. Right? Just scale it like that. And maybe I could make a plane down here to kind of close it. You know, so you can really kind of do anything. And I think one thing to watch out for too, and you'll find this out when you start to model it, will just be, you know, like how do you think about, so for example, with this model, right? This is going to be difficult to print because there's an overhang right there. And this is a horizontal line that's just printing out in space. And so when the printer gets to that location, it's just going to start printing on top of, in thin air, right? It's just going to start printing on top of nothing. And so what you really want to do is find a configuration or think about, you know, how the support would need to work. You know, so you can model little columns and stuff like that that maybe you break off later that will support, you know, areas that are not supported in the geometry. So maybe that factors into how you prepare your model. There you go. You make some cool stuff. All right, so that concludes this tutorial.